podcast where we put you on the map. This is Ron Costa, broadcasting live in the Mappable USA studios in Las Vegas. And today, folks, we're going to bring our conversations back to opportunity zones. And to do that, let's bring in Vicki Hutchmala from the QOZ Marketplace. Vicki, how are you today?
I'm great today, Ron. It's the first day of autumn, and Vegas has got the perfect degrees in the 80s. What could be better? We have an outstanding guest today. We're going to talk about where opportunity zones have come since it started the program in 2017, so it should be fun.
Great. So let's introduce our guest then. We have Michael Sanders over at the law offices of Blank Rome. He's a senior tax partner. Michael, how are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you.
Great. So you're located out in Washington, D.C., huh?
Correct.
Great. So you're very close to where all this stuff happens with opportunity zones and all the laws that they're making and all the requirements. You get a front view seat of it all.
Right, and I'm also doing setting up a lot of funds, opportunity zone funds, both large funds that in effect are raising dollars across the country, as well as what I would say are captive opportunity zone funds where individuals or private family offices have gains they want to consider for subsequent investment in opportunity zones.
Right. Okay. Well, before we get into the meat of the conversation here, why don't you tell people in our audience your background, how you kind of got started in this whole thing to begin with?
Well, I am a tax lawyer. I'm a deal lawyer. I also teach the subject in the graduate tax program at Georgetown Law School. But I've been, in my career, doing a lot of, let's say, tax credit work, federal historic, new market tax credit programs that are focused on helping the poor, community benefit. And it seemed like a logical fit early on to get involved in the opportunity zone funds. I also represent a lot of 501c3 organizations that are attempting to provide benefit for high unemployment areas. So this works together. All of it ties together.
How do you connect 501c organizations with opportunity zones?
Well, so many of them, like organizations that focus on low-income housing, that use the low-income housing tax credit to generate funds. So much of the work is in high unemployment areas, large poverty, census tracts. So it makes sense for these organizations, through potentially affiliated companies or organizations, to take advantage of the Opportunity Zone Fund tax benefits and legislation by attracting funds to these communities.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and Michael, now to that point, there's so many recent articles that we're seeing online right now and in the papers all about opportunity zones, and some of them talk about the opportunity zone successes. Some of them talk about why the program won't work. You really don't know what's going on. What's your take on some of this stuff that we're seeing in the news right now?
Well, thanks for asking the question. When the historic tax credit or new markets or low-income housing tax credits first were enacted, you had a lot of criticism as well as to how successful the program is. Well, we've seen recent articles that many of them provide very good substantive information about projects that are moving forward, but the editorial part of the article is somewhat negative because they're suggesting that the legislation is enriching upper income people and so on, and without providing the adequate benefits to the communities. So let me just comment on that, because I think the articles at this point are premature. The legislation is bipartisan, and it was sponsored by Senators Booker and Scott. So you can't say it was a particular tax break as such. I mean, the purpose of it was to attract what I would say are rich people who have generated capital gain and are interested in taking advantage of the Opportunity Zone Fund, in effect, by redistributing these funds into high unemployment area, which is the right goal. The articles, in many cases, as I say, are criticizing the program before the program really is ready to be evaluated. But the articles, in a way, I think, prove the initial success of the program, because they point up the various projects, including building a high-end hotel or apartment building, which will rejuvenate a low-income area, which is the purpose. It's a catalyst, and also will generate employment. So my reaction is that the articles actually support the early success of the program, even though the Treasury guidance and the regulations have been slow and have raised other issues. Keep in mind, the result is to improve communities by providing mixed income projects. So I'm saying it's a little early to evaluate whether the program is a success, but it has obvious potential. And yes.
I've read some of those articles that are relatively negative, and they seem to associate the Opportunity Zone initiative now with all of the other past real estate investments into depressed areas. And as you say, I think it's too early. There's no history for the success or failure of any of these projects because there isn't enough time has passed in order to know whether they've been successful or not. And I believe that the very key to success is putting the right project in the right opportunity zone to get the best benefit. Plus, it can't really benefit the wealthy people when you have to wait 10 years to realize the full benefit.
That's right. And you just made a very good point, because the 10-year marriage is not typical. And, in our finance world, people don't like to commit for 10 years. So,
right.
You also oftentimes, most times, are going to sell when the market conditions are ripe. So for you to take your dollars and lock them away for 10 years at least in order to get the real exclusion benefit, that's asking a lot of an investor.
Right, and in this economy that we're enjoying now, you don't necessarily have to be a person of wealth per se to participate in the program, because so many people through their employment investments, through their 401s and that, have realized capital gains that maybe have never realized them to that extent before, but it gives them the opportunity to participate in the market.
Well, not through a 401k.
Well, but through stocks and through things that they've sold that otherwise they wouldn't have thought of, because the economy is helping that aspect.
True.
Yeah. And you know what also, Michael, I think, let's face it, Donald Trump is certainly a polarizing person, and whether you like him or not, I wonder if him getting behind this program kind of helps feed the kind of like the negative take on this from the media, because they don't seem to help him at all with none of this stuff that he's doing. I mean, would the media be reporting upon this in a negative tone if really Trump wasn't behind it, do you think, or do you think that has nothing to do with it?
Well, I don't want to comment on that side.
Okay.
My only comment would be that many of the articles say this is a Trump tax break, and I think that is not really so. Because,
right.
like I said before, Senators Booker and Scott initiated this.
Yes. Yes, and another interesting point, I was talking to somebody about this over the weekend on opportunity zones, and he told me, Ron, the first set of guidelines came out, and, okay, it set forth the program for the most part. The second one was supposed to clear things, and it really created more questions. Now more questions are coming out here. When will there be a kind of like a part of this program that says, okay, this is the way it is, and we're going to take it from there? Or,
yeah. See, the problem is the second set of regulations, it's like 180 pages, did answer a number of questions, but it raised so many others, and it's highly technical. So it's really a gold mine for the tax lawyer and the tax accountant, but it doesn't necessarily help the developer who's looking for direction, saying, okay, how do I do it? And he doesn't want to hear from a tax lawyer explaining, well, this and this rule and that rule, but then again, you got to look at the disguised sale rules and the consolidated return issues and so on. That part is confusing. So to answer your question, Treasury is likely to combine the two sets of regulations with some modification before the end of this year. I don't believe we'll see any new regulations. So we're going to see permanent, in effect, the regs will be permanent the end of the year. And hopefully there will be continued guidance issued because there are a number of questions which I'll get to at the back end of the podcast.
Okay, yeah, that's great. But in the meantime now, okay, there's a lot to be considered in terms of the market itself. Right, because that's a very interesting topic too. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, these are my thoughts. Generally, developers, real estate developers, incubators on the business side. I'm getting regular calls from potential investors, high net worth family offices, looking for opportunities, and I think there are more investors than there are opportunities for development or businesses to move into opportunity zones. Keep in mind also, the end of this year is meaningful in order to get the full 15% discount on the gain that's deferred and needs to be reported in 2026. So there's going to be a lot of activity before the end of the year. That is if you want the full 15%, because 5% of the discount is lost unless the investment takes place before the end of the year. Congress could very well replenish that 5%, so we have to wait and see. Go ahead.
Projects are hard to place. If you live in Vegas, for example, and there's opportunities around, and you have funds and you want to invest in whatever area, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the correct area that you should invest in, because you have to look at the future to see what kind of returns are going to come if you build a multi-family building, for example. You have to build it in a location where you're going to know that the rents are going to continue for the full 10 years of your investment, and it's not going to fill up, and then maybe they can't afford to stay there in 3 or 4 or 6 months, and now everybody who moved in has moved out. Or you can't put a luxury high-rise hotel in the middle of a totally depressed area where there's no jobs, no employment, and now you have to support that, where the crime rate may be higher than in other locations. Nobody's going to want to go to whatever project you've built. So there's a lot of other details that you have to look at besides just, well, I live in Vegas and I want to invest in Vegas. You can't necessarily just assume that it's an opportunity zone, you have capital gains, you create the fund, and now you're good to go and everything's going to turn out fine. You have to really investigate the market to make sure you're going into the most viable location.
you just made a very, very important point. You've got to look at the quality of the potential investment. This is not simply a tax mechanism. If the investment doesn't stand on its own, put the tax aside. Don't make it. Okay?
Exactly.
Yeah, because if you're investing in a project that's going to fail, then it's obvious. There's no benefit there you're certainly better off paying your capital gains taxes to begin with, or look for a different program. But that is really true. And you made a great point, Michael, before with saying how scarce the really good projects are. There's a lot of investors out there, and what we're seeing across our desks is the same kind of thing. Well, what's a good investment? Where should we be? Well, what have you heard? And it's hard to find a really, really strong project, and I'm sure that you come across that as well.
Well, right, because what's happening is many of these projects, potential projects in Opportunity Zone funds, have appreciated significantly. And, from the investor standpoint, comparing one to the other is not easy, but he doesn't want to overpay. And so it's pure, when you get to the real estate, conventional real estate criteria apply. Now, moving businesses like incubators into Opportunity Zones is an attractive area to explore. But not all the investors are comfortable with new businesses. So that's another issue.
Yeah.
And we're noticing that in terms of projects, that people are primarily their projects are being focused on residential type projects and not necessarily bringing business in, which brings in jobs, which brings in income, which is the point of the program, to elevate the community where the Opportunity Zone is. So do you think will the market change that so that people will kind of focus more on business development instead of building per se?
Well, you make another very good point there. So we are seeing multifamily, a lot of multifamily. But I'm also getting calls about incubator business investment. A number of my clients are focusing in that area. So I do think there will be an increase in that direction. But you should also keep in mind that there's an issue today as to whether the investment should be in multi-assets, leading to diversification, as compared to a single asset. And the single asset is easier to take advantage of the exclusion after 10 years under the regulations. So that itself is an interesting issue because of some of the problems that have not yet been solved, raised in the regulations. So if you have a minute, I'd like to go through some of those open questions and some planning issues. But I will say this. At this point, unfortunately, Opportunity Zones and the program is still viewed with some skepticism and uncertainty. Once Treasury and the market can make Opportunity Zones synonymous with opportunity instead of uncertainty,
exactly,
be more attainable. When clients come to me, I show them how to do it. I'm not telling them, oh my God, you got this issue and that issue. Sure, I'm recognizing the issues, but I'm trying to provide solutions so we can take advantage of the program now. So if you have a minute or so,
yeah, let's go over those points. That sounds great.
Let me go over some of them. One of the issues, which is a Section 1231 issue, and that's where You have gains from property used in a trade or business, like the sale of a shopping center. You have gain, 1231 gain. Under these new regulations, you have to net and make a determination on the last day of the taxable year as to the gain. You can't, let's say you have your gain in April. You can't, the 6 months doesn't start in April. You got to wait till the end of the year. You don't have what I would say is optionality under the regs today. You got to net your gains with your losses, and this applies to the partners, not the partnership itself. So you have a determination only on the last day of the taxable year, which then triggers the 180-day period for reinvesting, which impacts as well on your holding period. And the problem with that is the last day of the taxable year, you really have 1 day to take advantage of that 2019 investment. But you won't even know how to net because you don't have your K-1s from your other investments.
To know what you're doing.
Right, till 3 or 4 months later when the accountants get that to you at least. So reinvestment can be stalled. Now, I do believe Treasury will solve this at the end of the year. Well, so we do have an issue there. There are some ways to work around it. But this is a real problem today because so many of the gains are generated through what we call sale of property used in a trade or business. So that's one issue. Second issue, and I'm going to summarize this one for you without going through too much technicality. The regulations is inconsistent treatment of gain after 10 years. And that's the important point. I mean, the real excitement here is to have substantial gain that you generate after a 10-year hold that's not subject to tax. Well, you get there if the investor, equity investor, sells his QOF interest. The rules eliminate any gain on the investor himself or herself selling their qualifying investment after the 10-year hold, regardless of whether the investor has used net losses during the period due to depreciation or whether the investor has received leveraged distributions from the QOF. Now, that's great, except what if the QOF sells the asset itself rather than the investor selling his equity interest? In that case, you have to look at the Schedule K-1 that you receive, and it's only to the extent of the capital gain from the sale of the property by that QOF partnership that's reported on the K-1 is available for exclusion, assuming you've had a 10-year hold. But the election to exclude does not apply to gross income, let's say, characterized as ordinary income, such as depreciation recapture of what they call 1245 assets. So, I mean, you're going to end up not getting the full benefit. And as a third leg here, this election appears to apply only to gains from certain disposition of asset by the QOF itself or the investor, and doesn't technically apply to gain recognized by the underlying business, the QOZB. It's unclear whether this is intentional, but this is a real issue because the typical structure, we drop the dollars from the QOF down into a QOZB, and the QOZB is the one takes advantage of the 31-month safe harbor relative to working capital and actually develops. So this is a technical problem that will need to be solved. So I'll stop for a second if you have any questions, and then I'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, you would think that since this program is under the auspice of the IRS, that they would have recognized these issues and created regulations or rules, or just made it where it coincides. So if you're basing something on your K-1, then your deadline should be when you're filing your tax return, not the end of the tax year, because as you said, you don't have all of the information yet. So it seems that the IRS needs to coordinate what is required under the program with what is required under the IRS code to make it work more smoothly.
Well,
that should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, well, the 1231 issue, the problem is sort of reversed in a way, because if I sell my shopping center in April, I should be able to start my 180 days and reinvest now, not have to wait until the last day of the year, which is what I'm told under the regulations. And actually, that's when the 180 days starts. So that causes me to basically sit back and wait, which is not the way business works. You're not treated as having sold until the last day of the year, and then you're not going to be able to net your 1231 gains against losses because you don't know what your actual losses are until you get ones. I mean, it's all confusing, not practical.
Well, that's the key word. It's not practical. It's relatively not functional, and it puts up roadblocks to a program that should be more beneficial to the community, which it's not, because people are afraid to get involved because there's too many complications involved in participation.
Well, and also, you call your tax lawyer up, and the tax lawyer raises all these technical issues. So what is the investor or the home office advisor, what do they say? Let's slow down and wait for more guidance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And time passes, and then now what do you do?
Right. But I'm saying something else to you. I'm saying now's the time to move forward. We can solve this in good faith. We can help you move forward. Don't defer. If you've got a good opportunity, take advantage of it.
No, that definitely makes sense. And Michael, I was on your website the other day. I believe it's the blankrome.com, and you have a event coming up, I believe, which is entitled "Practical Aspects of Compliance with Opportunity Zones and Regulations: Traps for the Unwary." And I would imagine these are kind of the things you're going to talk about at that presentation, right?
Yes.
All right, good.
Yes,
good.
If anybody wants, they can follow up with me.
Yeah, that's excellent. How do people get a hold of you?
My email address is sanders@blankrome.com, or they can call at 202-772-5808.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, we'll put that on the show notes as well. And you really opened some interesting questions to people in the audience here with these issues with opportunity zones. It's really it's an eye opener for sure.
If you give me another 2 minutes, I want to make another point here.
By all means.
For planning purposes, you need to compare an investor where they have real estate, compare the use of 1031 to opportunity zone investments. And the opportunity zone side, the OZBP, which is opportunity zone property, is not restricted to real estate, which 1031s are. It's available to capital gains, to hedge funds, for example, among others. Also, 1031s, you need to invest the net sales proceeds. In the opportunity zone, you only invest the gain, capital gain portion. 1031, the deferral can be permanent. Get a basis step up at death. While opportunity zones allows a permanent basis step up without the need to die if you hold your equity interest for 10 years. The opportunity zone option, by the way, and this is important, is available for a busted 1031. No, you start, go down the road, 5 months in, not going to work. The qualified intermediary gives you the dollars back, but you're still within 180 days. So keep that in mind. And finally, the opportunity zone may do a 1031 rollover. In other words, the fund itself, but it's going to have to meet the substantial improvement test, among other things. But they themselves, the fund, can do a 1031.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. So I'm not going to go into the advantages of leasing properties, which would include related parties, or also the triple net lease, land banking.
And people don't take that into consideration, the leasing factor or the probate factor either of continuing to heirs through trust.
Yes.
Well, we could do a whole podcast on that too. Right?
There are other issues, yes, and there are other issues, unimproved, vacant land, and so on, which could be subject to another podcast.
And people don't they automatically assume that opportunity zones are in municipalities, where many of the opportunity zones are in rural locations that require a whole different set of criteria in order to decide what project to put there.
Yes, and also new market tax credit applications, which are due within a month. The fact that you're in an opportunity zone clearly is going to help you.
Right.
So you can get a
I have one.
Double.
I have one
last question.
One last question before we close out. What do you think the future of opportunity zones and the program itself is based on all this information that we just talked about today?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I'm excited about the program. I think, it's going to take a little more time to get the guidance out there. But when you think about two tax advantages, one, of course, is deferring tax and reducing the amount of capital gain tax you otherwise would have to pay. And many of the states, by the way, are joining forces. They're coming up with different programs that are going side by side with the federal program. Another additional benefit. But then the fact that if you hold for 10 years, you can exclude gain. Let's say we're starting up a new business that's going to be the equivalent of eBay, and we set the business up in an opportunity zone. Get all this appreciation, potentially stock, and down the road after 10 years, you sell your interest and you don't have any gain to pay. I mean, what an opportunity.
Exactly.
And it should generate substantial development, and that's why I think the program is excellent. Move people, jobs, into those programs, and should help the nonprofits as well that are focused on those communities. So I am very optimistic about this whole program.
Yep. No, same here. That sounds great. So, Michael, listen, we really appreciate you coming on our podcast today and talking to our audience about this. I think we got some really good information, and hopefully we can get you one again a little later on as this thing moves forward and progresses with any new news and stuff. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you both.
Great,
Bye.
great. And Vicki, thanks for co-hosting the podcast. And again, this is Ron Costa. You're listening to the Mappable USA podcast, where we put you on the map go to our website, mappableusa.com, and scroll down there. You'll see all our syndication sources. You pick the one you like best so you never miss another podcast. If you want to be a guest on the show today, like Michael was, there's a guest tab there. You can just click on that, fill out the form. We'll see what you can do about getting you on the show. And once again, we want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for your support. And we'll see you next week on another Mappable USA podcast. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great week.